As geopolitical issues become part of boardroom conversations, a deeper understanding of China's economic landscape is no longer optional. China in the Changing Geoeconomic Landscape is a 4-week fully virtual course by Takshashila Institution on how China is reshaping trade, finance, and global power. You'll unpack China's rise, its economic model, de risking, trade as strategy, and Beijing's push to reform the global financial order. Applications close on 20th January 2026. Apply now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. I'm Aishwaria Sonavane, Research Analyst for Pakistan Studies here at Takshashila, and your host for today. I'm joined by Danish Zahoor to talk about the broader phenomena of modern slavery today. Danish is a doctoral researcher at the University of Leeds, studying migration and modern slavery in the UK's agriculture sector. When we talk about slavery today, it's often spoken of retrospectively, but in reality, it's both a historical feature and a present day crisis. We are very happy to have you here, Danish. Welcome, and I hope to learn so much more about this concept.
Thank you so much for having me, Ash.
Let's start with the basics. Because the term gets used a lot, but not always very clearly. When we say modern slavery, what are we actually talking about in today's world? And how is it different from older, more traditional understanding of slavery?
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the older historical context here, and a lot of, in fact, it's inevitable to see today's so-called contemporary state slavery or modern slavery is just inevitable to. It's impossible to see it without that broader historical context that we've had in the past. I mean, the antebellum slavery, the uprooting of African slaves and just shipping them over to the US, to the Americas, in fact. But today, when we speak about slavery, it's more nuanced. It's more multifaceted. It's not as monolithic as it was back then. We, looking at it from a historical perspective, we are more used to seeing a lot of physical coercion in historical slavery, but that physical coercion has somewhat evolved into more economic coercion, if you will, it's more about control these days. When we speak about modern slavery, it's more about power imbalance. It's a lot about supply chains, where there are lots of different dynamic amongst these different players. So today, modern slavery is less about ownership and more about control and power dynamics, more about nuance. It has a range of different issues. It can start off from indebtedness to human trafficking, or even to the more extreme issues of sexual exploitation amongst laborers, amongst workers. And of course, a lot of these issues, along this spectrum, there are lots of other issues packed in. There are issues regarding housing. There are issues regarding wage theft, document fraud, confiscation of important documents, identity documents, especially like passports. So all of these different issues that border on, serious human rights violations amongst workers specifically. That's something that we are looking at, and the tragedy is that we do not have a universally accepted definition of modern slavery today. We look at modern slavery in different contexts, but if you ask me to give you a universal definition, we don't have it yet. That is problematic, but that's also a little helpful in some ways, because that allows us to broaden the scope. That allows us to look at less. There are issues that media laps up. There are issues that are extremely serious to the public eye, but there are also issues that are more prolonged, that are more chronic, and that are less that garner less media attention. But that anyway, they're equally serious, or even more, for the workers. They contribute to their vulnerability. So even those issues are taken into this scope of modern slavery today. So it's good in a way to have a broad scope to include a range of different issues into this spectrum.
Right. So what strikes me here is that unlike historical slavery, this isn't always visible and it's not legally sanctioned, obviously. That's interesting because when we look at India specifically, we often think of forced labor as something that's marginal or exceptional. But India consistently ranks high in global estimates of people living in conditions of modern slavery. Again, like you said, there's no exact definition. But why is that? What structural factors make India particularly vulnerable to this?
Well, I think it's not just India. In fact, it is the so-called global North-South divide. What we've seen, especially since the liberalization of Indian economy in the early 90s, is the fact that there's a new pattern of work, there's a new pattern of global economic integration that India has gone through, in the sense that we have a lot of outsourcing of dirty work to our countries, to the global south, while your iPhones and your iPads and your MacBooks are designed in California. That's where the clean work happens. That's where the digital work happens. The soft touches, go into your MacBook there. But the dirty work really happens in our countries, in the factories of China, Vietnam, or even in India to some extent, especially if not at least some. Parts of this assembly. Likewise, the footwear companies that outsource their manufacturing in these parts of the world.
Textile in Bangladesh.
Yes, I mean, the Rana Plaza issue was a huge, it was a
Yeah.
huge flare up in this conversation. But that's how it is. I mean, this is the kind of global economic dynamic that we are going through today. Look at the issues that are now emerging in our literature, in modern slavery literature. They have just begun to emerge. Those of India's IT sector, the white collar modern slavery, extremely exploitative. In some cases, people have lost their lives, long working hours, paltry pay. And these are issues that go completely unnoticed in India today. We don't have institutions strong enough. We don't have media coverage of these issues. We have absolutely no interest amongst unions. I mean, the unions are virtually non-existent in these spaces. So these are some of the issues that have been emerging in the last 30 odd years since India's liberalization, where India as an economy is pandering to the interests of the big corporations. The moment this needle starts to incline more towards the workers, that's when the investors start becoming unhappy with you, and they start pulling out their investments, or they move elsewhere. So that's the kind of power imbalance again that we're looking at in India right now.
Especially what comes to my mind with the recent controversy is also the gig workers in India. Does the gig economy come under modern slavery, or how does that work? If you could quickly touch up on that as well.
I think in the recent times, one of the most heartening things that happened in this space was the fact that these workers, there was a semblance of organization with this nationwide strike being called. But that's really the heart of the issue. The fact that the gig workers are an unorganized mass of the Indian economy. They are the so-called soft underbelly of the Indian economy. They work in the dark alleys. Nobody knows who delivers stuff to your doorsteps. Nobody knows. There's just a lot of unorganized mess out there, which is hard to monitor, which is hard to govern. Companies always have a distance. I mean, these are agencies that are working on behalf of the companies, on behalf of the big giants who portray themselves as responsible businesses a lot of times. But the reality is, when push comes to shove, the companies distance themselves from the outsourced agencies. I mean, they have nothing to do with it. Even legally, they have some amount of impunity, because these are simply outsourced operations, and the real sellers or the real service providers have nothing to do with them. So these are the issues that we are currently dealing with, and in fact, not just in India, but these are issues that we're also looking at in the developed world. At least the kind of project that I'm doing, that I'm focused on, it involves a very lengthy supply chain where there's a lot of gap between different stakeholders, and nobody's willing to take responsibility for the workers. So
Yeah.
these are the issues that we're dealing with.
That's another important point, and I'll come back to how policymakers deal with this in India or policy making across the so-called global north. But before we get into that, I want to come back to this concept of modern slavery and zoom out a little modern slavery, it doesn't exist in isolation today, right? It intersects with other global issues like climate change and digital revolution. So, according to you, how do these factors kind of contribute into greater vulnerability to modern slavery? How we often talk about climate change, the wealth distribution, unequal wealth distribution, and the digital revolution. How do these factors come into play?
I think both of these factors have two aspects to them. I mean, let's talk about climate change first. Climate change creates its own vulnerabilities amongst populations. I mean, climate related migration, climate shocks, these vulnerabilize the workers. These are people living in sub-Saharan Africa, coastal areas that are vulnerable to floods. And when they migrate to another geography, so to say, these workers extremely desperate to find a new livelihood. They're uprooted from their own hometowns, from their culture, from their conventional sources of livelihood, and now they are into this completely alien territory where getting exploited is very easy. And that's that's what we are seeing a lot amongst those countries as well, where we have conflicts or wars. We have Ukraine, where we have, in the past we had Yemen, Syria, and these are workers that are extremely vulnerable to modern slavery because of the kind of desperation they face along with their families. Likewise, exploited workers in modern slavery are used as instruments for perpetrating climate change, for perpetrating illegal deforestation in many regions of the world, South America, for instance. These are anyway illegitimate operations. These are operations that are happening under the shadows completely. There's absolutely no monitoring, and therefore it's convenient for businesses, for operators to get illegal deforestation, illegal mining done through them. And these are so that's how at in both aspects climate change is interrelated with modern slavery. Likewise, technology. While digital technology has a positive side to it, digital technology can contribute. For instance, blockchain technology. Blockchain technology is now beginning to be used in supply chains to find out the value that is being added at each stage of the supply chain. And the moment there's a drop in value, it could be presumed to be because a result of modern slavery, a result of wage theft, a result of non-payment of dues to the workers. So that's something that digital technology can actually bring in through, especially blockchain, the blockchain technology. But the other aspect of digital technology is also the micro management, micro surveillance of these workers. For instance, the kind of the farms that I'm looking at in the UK, the moment they start becoming technologically adept in terms of surveillance, you can only imagine the kind of control and the kind of, in some cases, harassment that the workers can face. I mean, all you need to do to worsen the condition of these workers at the hands of unscrupulous employers is to give their employers digital technology, give their employers better devices of surveillance, and things will only get worse for these workers.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. Also, something that you mentioned before this was armed conflicts and wars in Russia, Ukraine, how fighters didn't know and they were forced to fight in this war. And one example that comes to my mind is how terrorist groups also were involved in this practice. For instance, the Islamic State, when the Islamic State held some territory in Iraq and Syria, they enslaved the Yazidi minority in the 2014 massacre in Iraq, where additionally to killing the Yazidis, the Islamic State enslaved and impregnated women for systemic ethnic cleansing, which was intended to, eliminate the ethnic identity of the Yazidi community through forced rape. So it takes so many forms when I think of it. Even I think if historically we look at it, how the Nazi Germany used forced labor and how even the Imperial Japan's military used sexual enslavement, and how we still sort of see that play out in today's armed conflicts or even
Absolutely.
wars
I
that
mean,
happen.
yes, I mean there is a significant gender aspect to modern slavery as well, in the sense that women have experienced modern slavery completely different, at least in some ways differently as compared to men. Not to say
Absolutely.
that men face any lesser challenges, but the nature of exploitation is somewhat different in this very gendered conversation. I mean, sexual exploitation is extremely common in this, especially when it comes to the kind of power imbalance that we see in modern slavery, where employers ask sexual favors with their female workers. But then in a conflict situation like you spoke about, there's also this, rape is used as an instrument of, it's as an instrument of shaming the opponents.
Yeah.
It also stems from this patriarchal desire for womb control, extremely disastrous. But in the context of modern slavery, while sexual exploitation is one part of it, we see a diverse range of issues emanating from this conversation.
Absolutely. Women's bodies have been disproportionately affected by modern slavery, for sure. When we also talk about human trafficking, forced labor, forced marriages, I'm sure comes into this. But since we talk about armed conflict and war, this naturally leads us to the conversation of migration. Because not just war, even climate related displacement, it often pushes people across borders. Migration is often framed as a choice, but in many cases, it's closer to compulsion. We've seen this conversation, we've heard this conversation in media circles, in policy circles, even during the refugee crisis. So, how does migration, especially irregular migration, feed into modern slavery networks?
So I think I'm glad you spoke about choice. Migration is a choice, but a more a more nuanced question regarding the agency of the workers needs to be asked. I mean, how many of the workers that I'm working with, especially these are picking fruits on UK's farms. How many of these workers dreamt of doing this job in their own home countries, coming in from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan? How many of these workers do you think dreamt of, growing up, dreamt of picking crops in the UK? I doubt any one of them did. The reality is, with the kind of global economic recession, with the kind of demographic shift that we see in these countries, both in the developed West as well as the developing Eastern parts of the world, Central Asia, South Asia, Eastern Europe, there's very little room left for choice, for workers' agency. And that inevitably means many of these workers are forced to migrate. Many of these workers are not able to find opportunities in their own home countries, which are where in many of these countries there's, we've seen cases of elite capture, we've seen enormous inflation, we've seen conflict, there's unemployment. So a lot of these workers are forced to move to greener pastures, to the UK, Canada, Australia, Italy, Western Europe in total. So what really happens is migration itself is a sort of vulnerability in these Western countries, especially today charged with the undertones of racism, xenophobia. It
Yeah.
is, and by default, it is a disadvantage to the workers, where the laws do not, a lot of the times, many laws that apply to the UK citizens, for instance, do not apply to the migrants. They do not have access to public funds, for instance. They do not have access to public healthcare. Their visas are closely tied to their employers, which means the moment they lose their jobs, they are sent back home immediately, because they'll also lose their visa. And this happens a lot of times. This happens after the poor workers have come into the UK by taking out a loan, getting indebted, paying a humongous amount of money to agents, also to the UK Home Office in the form of visa fees. And then suddenly you're sent one day packing back home in a couple of months because the employer didn't like your work. So these are the
Yeah.
kind of vulnerabilities that we are looking at that are closely affiliated with migration. As you can imagine, these vulnerabilities are even worse for migrants coming in from war zones like Ukraine.
Mhm.
Currently, Ukraine is one of the top contributors of these seasonal worker visas, seasonal workers that I'm currently working with. In the past, we had people coming in from Nepal, people coming in from Central Asia. There were people coming in Europe, especially. There were people coming in from Syria and Yemen, war-torn countries. So, as you can imagine, their conditions are even worse. Their vulnerabilities are even more serious. Their family situation is even more concerning. So, yeah, migration, while itself is a vulnerability, conflict, climate change, wars make it only worse.
Right. And like I said, I want to bring this back to policy and how India does not necessarily lack legislation. We have the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act, the Child Labor Act, anti trafficking provisions in the IPC. We have labor codes. However, are these laws too fragmented to address the concept of modern slavery? And have there been any laws that we can draw inspiration from around the world that have actually worked?
Mhm. The reality is that when we talk about modern slavery, it inevitably stems from a certain perspective. Some would call a theoretical perspective of rights, something that's not natural, something that's almost cooked up in the West. And that's why we see modern slavery laws in the UK. We see modern slavery laws in Australia that followed close on heels with the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 in the UK. We have Modern Slavery Act in some form in some states in the US. So yes, while these are significant developments in global law, global legislation, these Western countries, we do not have a single unified Modern Slavery Act in India. So yes, I agree with you with the fact that it makes our modern slavery legislative landscape in India that much more fragmented because these issues are looked at in isolation. These issues are bonded labor, child labor. I mean, all of these issues are definitely serious issues, but we do not really have a unified way of bringing them together in the form of one legislation, probably because the awareness is missing in India, or the awareness has not dawned upon us. The issue has not dawned upon us in all its seriousness yet. But I think I'm very hopeful with the kind of conversations that we are seeing in, at least for now, in the white collar circles in India. We will soon have a modern slavery act, a unified modern slavery act going forward, not just for one particular sector in India, but for the whole economy in general. But as you know, India comes with its own challenges. Indian economy is enormous. The unorganized sector is huge in India, which makes surveillance, which makes monitoring extremely challenging. So while we are hopeful, while we must be hopeful, because we are we are an active part of the global economy, and we're keeping tabs on what's happening in elsewhere. But we must also not discount the fact that Indian economy has its own serious challenges, which could undermine any efforts to against modern slavery going forward.
Absolutely. And I think this is a conversation that is worth having and sustaining for as long as we need to. But thank you so much for sitting down with me and having this conversation today. Uh, and I hope our listeners enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having this with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Ash. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.